All right, welcome to Q&A to those online and to those in the hall. Um, I don't know if anybody has any question today. Any question? Wow, this is looking great. Any question? Right, Chineye. Great, thank you, Fumi. Thank you, TJ. All right, 3. I know we have one from last week, so we'll take that. I think it's Ufoma's question from last week.
Okay, and none
So
online yet.
Yes, no, I've not seen any online. So that's 4 questions. Fantastic. All right. Can we have the mic for Fumi? So that Fumi can ask a question. Yes, Fumi, please go on.
So the question has actually been on my mind for a while. And I know you're not Pastor Tolu, but it started from the sermon Pastor Tolu preached up until today, particularly the topic of the sermon. I'm not sure. So in terms of service, right? What would you typically say to someone who feels that they can't really serve because they don't fit into a particular place? I feel like Pastor Lou's sermon was kind of also really touched about serving, also like what we talked about today. So I know that as Christians, you give in your best, serve wherever you are, workplace, church, and all that. But if someone who is saved, who has a heart of service, who really wants to serve, feels that they really don't fit in somewhere, and that has taken them away from service, how do they plug in? That's one. How do they begin to walk around that mindset, right? And then, yeah.
All right. Cool. Thank you. Thanks. Chineye and then TJ. We have one more question now, so it's 5. Yes. Chineye here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
My question is about what you were saying about rhythm instead of balance. So this is quite a relatively new concept to me because I've always been focusing on balance. So can you just expand a little bit on how that rhythmic living is different from trying to get a balance right instead?
Okay. Thanks. Thank you.
So my question is, how did Solomon end his life in terms of his relationship with God? Because Scripture says that after a while, the women turned his heart away from God.
Yes.
But they've been, I've seen some things online where they've said, look, if you look at Ecclesiastes and everything, it shows how his heart was eventually. And so firstly, how did he really end his life? Mm-hmm. Can we really say that he ended up with God or he was away? And if it's the case that his heart was really turned away from God and his relationship with God was never restored, what's the point of getting wisdom?
And,
when you lose, your relationship with God.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'm not questioning God, I'm just wondering.
Yeah. Like, why did God even give him if he was going to get him there? Thank you. All right, let me read the 2 questions we have online, one from last week and one from today. So this is from Ufoma. She says, please, what do you believe God's word to a woman being battered by her husband is? Should she abide, endure, and fight? So that's from Ufoma. By Nana Dirisu. She says, Satan isn't omnipresent, right? But how then does he operate? If he's limited to one place at a time, how is he seemingly able to wreak havoc in multiple places at once? All right. So we have our job cut out for us. 5 questions. Let me start from Chineye's question because I think it's a really important question. So difference between balance and rhythmic living. So I think the whole concept of balanced living, balanced living is generally in terms of illustrating work-life balance. So they would say you have a 9 to 5, but try to make out space for other things in your life. and that sort of thing. I think it comes from a good place. I think many of things that concept intends to capture is right. I think the only problem with it is that sometimes the way it comes across is that you give, it either comes across as you give a 50-50 effort to things, or you give, so you have two things. You sort of split your efforts across board, so 50-50, or you give 100-100, that sort of thing. So you give 50-50 to things. That's what it says. Or you give 100-100. I think the challenge with that is that it doesn't always make space for the stage of life a person is, the support system that they have, just some questions around economics, demography, those sort of things. And so what it ends up coming across like is, you can be good in everything. And I'm not quite sure the Bible actually says you can be good in everything. I think what the Bible calls us to is actually to prioritize things. So, your relationship with God is very important. Your work, your career is very important. Your relationship with your family, with people in your network is very important. And the way the Bible presents it is as though those things should sort of map our lives, or our lives should be guided by those things. And yet, there may be seasons of life where certain things take priority because of where you're at, because of what God is communicating to you at that particular point. So somebody who is, I don't think that somebody who is starting out in university, for instance, is going to have the level of balance that somebody who is much advanced in their career would have. Somebody who is just starting out in their career may not have the luxuries that somebody else has. And so I think the concept of rhythmic living captures that thing better, where it's like, consider the stage of life you're at, consider the resources God has given you, consider some of these other things. How best can you be human at this point? And human is not just in terms of, what skills do you have and all that, but how can you live up to the fullest potential that God has given you? And so I think that concept of rhythmic living captures it better because it helps you hold things in tension. And then also, if you do live paradoxically, like I think the Bible is calling us to, you can't live in balance. You do have to. There will be times when you dial up something to achieve a certain effect. There will be times where you reduce something to achieve a certain effect. And so it ultimately comes down to wisdom. Obviously, wisdom acquired from Scripture, but also wisdom as the Lord begins to mature a person, like Solomon was praying for a discerning heart, so that you do know, okay, how can I show empathy to my colleagues, or for someone like a CEO, how can I be among them? How can I play with them well? How can I distance myself? And thankfully, he's not around, but I think, because he's my boss, I see him a lot more. So I can use him as an example. I think Pastor Femi embodies that because I work with him directly. And so there will be days where it's like everybody's jabbing him in the office. Like we jab him steady, like steady. And yet, within that sort of being among, that, hey, this person is not one of us. Like he's your boss. And so I think that's ultimately what our service should look like, holding things in tension. But I don't know if Uncle has anything.
Yeah, I love I love that idea of a rhythm. So I think it brings a lot of things in focus. And this is where I think the church will be best served when people talk to themselves across generations. Because as a student, so that he's talking about, there are rhythms about your daily, weekly life, things that you're planning. But there are also rhythms about your life and career. And that's why, if your teen can be a member of things like Teen Guide, or where you can talk to older people, and even as a woman in her career, you look back and you say, I wish somebody had told me what to focus on as a student, or I should maximize my time as a student. That there'll be a time where I'll get into the workplace where I will be committed to certain things than others. For a lot of men, they'll delay marriage because they want to focus on career and getting wealthy, being able to afford a household. Then all of a sudden, they now have kids, and now find out that they're too old to stoop and play down with children and things like that. For our lives to have rhythm, to have this rhythmic balance, it needs a lot of wisdom. And there are many of us who are already in that place where the rhythm is messed up. So we can start by the daily, weekly things. In my day, make sure I give time to fellowship with God. Make sure I give my time to family. But maybe work dominates right now. But as I think of the next week, the next quarter, the next year of my life, and the next 5 years, I should be trying to bring things into better rhythm, so to speak. There are times where you look at your child, you're like, if one of us doesn't spend more time with this child, we're all going to be in trouble. And so your days become dominated by raising that child, at least a significant portion of the day than it was maybe 5 years ago. In order for our lives to work beautifully, it's not 50-50, it's not equal time, it's disequal, right? It's unequal, and you just have to say, in this phase of my life, in this season of my life, what do I need to pay attention more for everybody around me to flourish? If you're serving in church, you have to reorganize things in your house, right? Just so that the church can benefit from the gift and the calling that God has placed upon you. And this is when the Bible says older women teach the younger one, older men teach. This is where it makes it. It's also when grandparents are infused in family life. It's when friends and family, work in concert, community work in concert to make sure that we can help each other in all those seasons and bring our lives into that sort of balance. We need those things. We cannot have rhythm for our lives by ourselves. We do it in community. We do it across generations, and I wish a lot more of those conversations were happening.
Sorry, just to add. So again, the problem with balanced living is you either do 50-50 or you do 100-100. The problem with the 50-50 sort of approach is that you never actually become good at anything. Because you split your energy equally across board, there's nothing that you're giving yourself to actually become good at. The problem with the 100-100 approach is that you're assuming, A, that you're God and you have all the time in the world, that your energy is infinite, and so you can, and this is where this whole thing about a woman has a career, she's working 9 to 5 plus, right, depending on where you close traffic. Then you get home, but then I want to be this Proverbs 31 woman. At 9 p.m. you start cooking for the family. And then you go to bed at maybe like 12 or 11, and then you have to sort of press replay. And so a lot of people, that 100-100 approach leads to burnout. It leads to people actually then flaming out very quickly. People break down, all those kind of things. And so the rhythmic approach, for instance, can look like I work 9 to 5. I can't cook when I get home. So maybe I'll get someone to do that for me. And yet recognizing that family is a priority. And so when I'm at home, I'm at home. I'm not splitting time between computer and I'm with the kids, I'm with my spouse, and we're actually making use of the time that we have. And then we can catch up on the weekends. So I think that the concept of rhythm embodies that way that we're called to live better. Also, you can take things like, we should work and we should rest. If you work too much, that's overwork. If you rest too much, then you're being lazy. And so you hold those things in tension because both of them are equally important. So I hope that helps.
Okay. Do you want to let me take Fumi's question about finding a place to serve if you don't fit well. Where you may not fit well. Okay. And you're talking about serving in church. Is that a place? Anywhere.
Anywhere.
So I think the issue of service starts primarily because if we say serving, it's not about yourself, it's about God and his people primarily, or God primarily, and his people are kind of the first place of service, and then maybe in the world as you carry God's gift and God's gospel around. I think the first thing about service you need to first figure out is where is the need? Where is the need? So it's not so much, because when we think in terms of where I fit, we're looking at where maybe there's either it's a natural fit, my gifts are perfect for it. In other words, I want to serve only in the place where I feel I am called to. That's a luxury most church communities can't afford. But it also misses that there are numerous places that we can serve. I know people who do multiple things. I'm in the wrong direction. Wrong direction. All right.
So the question, just to be sure, who has the mic?
Microphone.
Can somebody? Okay, don't worry, say it and then we'll. So you don't fit in. Okay. You're serving somewhere and you don't fit very well. You are in a place, but you don't fit. You don't fit in that environment. So how do you serve in that place where you don't fit in?
Okay. So you already know you are serving somewhere, but you feel like you don't fit well, or you don't fit. Am I listening?
Let me help. So you're in a place, right? You're in a place, but you don't quite fit in that place. How do you serve in that place? Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
I think so. All right. I won't repeat because I think maybe I'm injecting something into it. But let me try and answer. Then maybe Emmanuel, who understands the English, right? Yeah. Okay. So if you don't fit in a place for maybe very, very objective reasons, you are still. I think what you then default to is the fact that God has called me to do whatever I do excellently well, right? Now, the place of service, the environment for service, is not always permanent in life. So you can say to myself, you can ask yourself, what gifts are these? Is this service calling me? What kind of time is it requiring? What kind of relational dynamics is calling or is taken from me? And make sure that you are giving the best that you possibly can until you find a better place, right? Because what not feeling you are fit for a place may indicate that the dynamics with the people, the chemistry or the relationships with the people are flawed, or that the environment is extremely trying, right? Or that maybe some of the gifts that are required to serve in that place, you're not fully developed, you're not fully functional in it. So two things can happen. You can grow into it, meaning your gifts come into full force, you learn how to manage those relationships better, the environment changes, or you learn how to manage that environment a little bit more. Or it could be you serve your time in that place and then you say, okay, I need to find somewhere else to go. Those are kind of the options that you have. But while you're there, if you feel like, if the service is benefiting people, you're seeing people to the glory of God, people's lives are being improved, you're impacting them, be joyful, be happy, even with all the difficulty, and then ask yourself how long you can keep doing that. How long do those people need your service? How long can you find that fit? Can you make that fit? Until, if the Lord then wills you to go somewhere else, or you find other opportunities, other places, better environment, better relationship dynamics, a better fit for your gift, and you can then make that transition out of there. But in the meanwhile, you can try to, because difficulties in service, in relationships are all opportunities for us to grow. We do not grow as Christians when we have perfect environment, perfect circumstances, or when we ourselves have the necessary full equipment to do that work. We all find ourselves in spaces where we feel a bit like a fraud. I don't know what they're asking me to do, or these people are asking me for something I don't even think I have, right? So it could be yourself, it could be the relationship, it could be the environment. Try and stretch yourself as much as possible to grow. I know when people think of, maybe even when you go to work in a place, most people will say, at least, when you join a company, you've always admired the company from afar, and then you join them, and then you find like it is like terrible. Sometimes you say to yourself, I can't just jump out. Let me try and last 1 year. And after 1 year, if you didn't die, and you develop some skill sets, you got paid, you've improved, you had some impact, you can say, can I go 1 more year in this place? Yeah, especially if the pay is good, or you are learning things, you are being exposed to things. And you can keep having that renewal with yourself until you say, okay, I think this work is harmful, or this thing, or I have something better that I can go and do. So you always try to stretch yourself as much as you can to grow within yourself until you reach what can be in what you call a natural end for that time or that phase of life or that place of service, and then you move on. I don't know.
No, I think ultimately, I think you've answered it. Yeah. Nothing to add. To TJ's question, so I'll just rephrase. So it's about Solomon, how he finished his life. Did he come back to God? But then if he didn't, then what was the point of the wisdom that he was given? Yeah, I think it's a tough one because we are not told expressly that he returned. I think what people sort of put together is like, I mean, if you take the view that he wrote Ecclesiastes, because some people think that Ecclesiastes is more somebody's different sayings put together or harmonized. So you could, maybe Solomon harmonized them, or different people under Solomon, wrote it, depending on what view you take. But if you do take the view that Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon, then you can see how it makes sense that he sort of returned. But I'm not sure. And I think as with many things, the Bible deliberately leaves it there for us as an open question for us to consider, that if somebody who started so well didn't finish well, we should be careful. So that sort of thing, like he says in 1 Corinthians, about these things happen to them as an example for us, lest we be tempted. And so I think that's one question, or that's sort of one approach, or at least the approach I would like to take, is that we don't conclusively know. I think the facts that are available to us is from 1 Kings 11, where he says that Solomon, and he says it a number of times in that passage to actually emphasize that Solomon did not fully walk with God. I think about 3 or so times. God wasn't pleased with Solomon. Solomon walked away from the Lord, or Solomon served other idols and different things like that. And so that's sort of what we are left with there. And because God wasn't pleased with Solomon, the text then tells us that God judges Solomon by giving him problems. Right? And so you see, like, if you don't please God, God will give you problem. And so, again, it seems the overwhelming thing is, like, this guy fails to be the king that God had sort of ordained him to be. So that's sort of the view that I would take, or at the very least say it's an open question.
May I say
yes, please go
that
ahead.
there's also a bit of warning, because even if you take the view approach Emmanuel takes and say, okay, he had a better frame of mind towards the end of his life, serve God. Riches doesn't help, knowledge doesn't help, pleasure doesn't help, only serve God. If he came to the right frame of mind, and you see that the book of Kings doesn't record, or still continues to record, some of those failures, it might be because there are some decisions he's made, some entanglements he's already made, that are then difficult to unmake. Right? So whether it's how many wives and concubines? 700 wives. And remember the 700 wives, 300 concubines were for political dalliances. In other words, whenever a king wanted to make, he had peace in his time, but part of how he tried to secure peace was to just marry women from all those nations. I don't know, how that's supposed to work. But it's, you've tied yourself to if you unmarry them, or if you decide, I'm trying to come back to God, and I have to undo some of the things that I've done. Maybe it then becomes war with all of these nations, or trouble around every side, and maybe he didn't have the courage to do that. I think for me, the warning is always that even when we are, the warning is for us to be wise about some of the sins or some of the entanglements that we get ourselves into, because they can be very, very difficult to come out of. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and to just sort of answer the second part of the question, I think it then actually shows us that whole thing that Proverbs says, and I think it says in the Psalms, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. There's a sense in which I think is right, that God gives Solomon wisdom to rule politically, but it does appear to me that the wisdom to rule politically didn't ultimately translate into a wisdom in terms of his relationship with God and fearing God. Because that is something that you are not gifted with that. That is something that you have to progressively work on. For instance, in Deuteronomy 17, that already talks about the coming to power of kings, well before the people of Israel ever made a request for kings. Part of the things that the king is supposed to do is that he is to make a copy of the law of God for himself, and is to read it regularly. And so it does seem like the narrator or the writers want us to see that this guy is wise, very, very wise. He can make right judgments. He can make political decisions. He can decide between cases, judicial issues. But when it comes to his relationship with God, he's not wise. And again, like Uncle Y said, I think that it's intended for us as a warning to then say, hey, how am I being wise with other things, but then not wise in terms of my relationship with God?
Yeah. Okay, the question from Nana: Satan isn't omnipresent, right? But then how then does he operate if he's limited to one place at a time? How is he able to speak, able to wreak havoc in multiple places at once? So if you look from scriptures, you see this concept of fallen angels, spirits, or demons. In Daniel chapter 10, Daniel prays, there's a picture of Daniel praying to the Lord, and that and the Bible sort of peels back, sort of the cosmic view of things, what's happening in the background of his prayer. And then Michael, the angel Michael, comes down and says, from the time where you began to pray, that God had actually heard all your prayers, and he had sent help. But we're being resisted by the prince of Persia, right? And it goes, and it's a fascinating, sort of look into the cosmic powers and effects and things like that. In the New Testament, Ephesians 2 talks about the prince of the power of the air, the spirit of disobedience that is the spirit at work in the children of disobedience. So we see this, demons, spirits, working on people. When Jesus was going around, the Bible talks about a woman who had, was it the issue of blood, and she says because a spirit had afflicted her and had bent her over for many, many years, and she had spent all her money. So we see activity of fallen angels, demons, in resisting the angels of God when they come to help the people of God. We see them working in people to work disobedience. And we see them working to afflict God's creation also in sickness and all that. So you are very right. Satan is not omnipresent. He works in concert with all his minions, these dark angels, fallen angels, demons, and things like that. And we're told to, that the conflict, the fight that we fight as Christians is not with flesh and blood. It's against all these things, all these unseen forces that are in the background. And we're asked to be to take the full armor of God to sort of resist them and fight them. So that's what the Bible says about how he's able to wreak havoc. There's a good book by C.S. Lewis, Screwtape Letters, that talks, for example, again, building on this sort of peeling back the cosmic veil, and it's a senior demon talking to a junior demon, and talking about how they're supposed to affect young Christians or Christians, young bucks who think that they're very, very hot, right? And it's supposed to help us, essentially be able to resist temptation and all that stuff.
Great, thanks. Ufama's question is the last. She says, please, what do you believe God's word to a woman being battered by her husband is? Should she abide, endure, and fight? This is a serious question and is a delicate one. Thinking on my feet, I hope I do it justice. Obviously, Uncle Y is here to chip in anything. But I do want to be clear. I don't think the Bible anywhere, so first, again, God institutes marriage, and marriage is meant to reflect something. Marriage is meant to reflect the union. Ultimately, marriage is meant to reflect the union between Christ and the church. Marriages that shine the best are marriages that point to that, whether the person is a Christian or the person is a non-Christian. I think non-Christian marriages that actually shine the best are non-Christian marriages that are rooted in the principle of that Christ and the church relationship. But there are times, as we know in life, that, and has happened historically here and continues to happen in different ways, that marriages don't embody that. And it's not just like, we have disagreements or we can't agree on things, but it's actually now where somebody is being assaulted, where somebody is being violated. And usually how people tend to answer that question is to say, because marriage is this really, 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 really important thing, we just have to stay there and endure. And in many cases, actually, it comes from a very good place. It comes from a place that has a high view of marriage. I think what has just happened is that a high view of marriage has been substituted for a low view of life. Because God calls us individually to actually flourish. God calls us individually to actually, live the lives, or like we've been talking about, dream the dreams and live up to his expectations for each and every one of us. And there are some times where God puts us in hard circumstances so that those things can happen. But that hard circumstance does not involve somebody being assaulted sexually, emotionally, physically. It doesn't involve somebody being battered. It doesn't involve somebody being abused. That's one. But secondly is that when life is at such a risk, the Bible, it's not just that the Bible gives permission for the person to actually live at that point. I think because of the Bible, the person is not just permitted, the person should leave that situation. And so if there's a woman, if you know personally from her, or maybe there's a woman who is listening, like, it's not just that should they not. The person should actually, for the sake of their sanity, for the sake of maybe their children involved, the person should leave that environment, should leave that space, and should invite other people to actually mediate in that situation. Now, where Christians now sort of split hairs is whether living physically should mean an end to that marriage. Depending on how, the circumstances, and if those people are plugged into a local church community and they know people, they might be able to get people involved in that situation. So there might be a case of, this person or this thing, is not how the marriage is characterized, was a mistake, blah, blah, blah. And even in that instance, there's still a good reason to actually stay separate for a while that thing is being worked on. But if there's a situation where there is constant, regular, somebody is being abused, somebody is being violated, I think that then falls in the 1 Corinthians 7 type of situation where it says, if you have somebody who is married to a non-believer and you are not threatened, the non-believer doesn't have any issues with you, you are fine there, except that the person is not a Christian. Then please stay. You don't have to leave. That's what it says in 1 Corinthians 7. But it then says that if you do have someone who walks away and abandons, then you are free. In that point, the point is that you are then free to go. But abandonment there does not just mean that abandonment physically. It doesn't just mean that the person has abandoned, like they've walked out of the home. It means, it can also mean, and as happens these days, that the person has abandoned their duty, their relationship to actually be, in most cases, the man, to actually be the kind of covering, to be the support, to be the leader that the person has become. In this case, the person is actually not now being husband, which is another word for gardener. This person is actually being destroyer. This person is mutilating. This person is attacking. This person is walking away. And so the person has abandoned their spouse. The person has abandoned their home. I don't want to get into this. If you are interested, I could give you theological whatevers for that. But that's what has happened. And so in that situation, the woman in question has the right to leave that relationship, the right to leave that home, to leave that marriage as well. And so to just bring it back is to say that under no circumstance does the Bible encourage, yes, marriage is important, marriage is sweet, marriage is God's picture for showing to the world his love for the church, and he's supposed to embody that. But at no point should marriage ever take priority over a person's life, a person's flourishing, a person's sanity. And then where it then becomes clearer that this is a situation where it's not just like, we had a bad day or we had an argument, but that this is what is habitually happening, whether emotionally, physically, psychologically. Somebody is constantly abusing, battering, or assaulting someone. Then the person in question, who most times is the female, can abandon, can leave that marriage, can divorce, can separate depending on what the person chooses. But I think that what the church will want to do is to come alongside that person, to know that the person has that right if they so choose, that God is not saying you have to stay, and also help the person then come back flourishing, whether it's receiving counsel, or just embracing and being around the person.
Perfect. And that's a full invitation by anyone here in this church who is going through something like that to come speak to. We have women leaders that you can speak to about that situation. And, Emmanuel is not just making an empty. The church will walk with you to help you in that kind of circumstance. It can be very difficult. Most people don't get support, can't tell family members because, shame and, complication. The church will walk with you and help you in that regard. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. Have a blessed week. See you next week.